All right. Can anyone hear me? Let me see the LinkedIn. Oh, I think it's working now. Okay. I see people coming in. I'm still waiting for Chad to get here. So let's give it a couple more minutes. Any questions, please comment on the LinkedIn comments. We'll see right away. Oh, there he is. So I'll be right back. Where is it? Do I just get you on? I think I got you on. Hey, Chad.
Hey, Shinji, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
Sorry. This is my very first time doing anything in this like live format as a host. So I'm just like figuring out how this works.
Oh, no,
But
no
now
problem.
I think it's working. And you're already live.
Okay, great.
Hopefully you're ready. So you're live, and I think we do have a number of people that have already joined us. I don't know how many, but I think there are. I've already told everyone to put comments so we can see what people are talking about and we can answer any questions during our chat.
Cool.
But yeah, good to see you. How are you?
Good. It's looking like it'll be another misty day here in Seattle, but other than that, good.
Cool. And you were just at AWS reInvent, right?
Yep.
Tell me about it. How was it?
It was a fun event. Not honestly, I didn't go in expecting a huge data crowd. I know it's more of like IT, software engineer type of stuff, but we actually had a pretty decent turnout. We did an event there. We had around 200 plus people, lots of data people, lots of non-data people. So seems like the whole data products, shift left stuff is starting to become a talking point, which is cool to see.
That's amazing. Why did you choose to reinvent it for your launch party?
Yeah. Yeah, I we did the launch party of Gable, which was, I mean, technically we announced back in September, but this was the first time we actually showed off the product to other people publicly.
Oh, cool. So did you guys do like demos and stuff?
We did. We did a demo. We talked through some of our plans and roadmap and new features and, all that kind of fun stuff. There were drinks
It's
and food.
exciting.
Yeah.
Awesome. I yeah, I think I got stuck in something, so I wasn't able to make it. But yeah, how was the rest of the conference?
It was good.
Did you stay or go to any of the conference
Yeah, I
events
went to a bit of the
or
conference.
sessions?
I didn't do that much. I just went, I think, like one of the days, and then I spent the rest of the time just meeting with folks around the conference, and old friends I haven't caught up with in a long time, and other founders and all that great jazz.
For sure. Yeah, I think reInvent is kind of that event where like you're not necessarily going to like listen to in sessions of like what AWS is coming out. It's
Mhm.
really around like reconnecting with everyone in the industry.
Right.
I'm sure a lot of other data conferences are like that too. But I
Mm.
think especially reInvent because there is like AWS covers just so much of the ecosystem, including data. So I think a lot of founders, investors, customers that are already on AWS are just like I think it creates a lot of really good ecosystem out of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's huge. There's, signs all over the airport, and yeah, they really take over Las Vegas, which I'd never been to reInvent before, so I was shocked at the scale of it, but I can understand why it's such a big hub to, you know, catch up and network and all that. Literally everyone is there. So
Cool. Awesome. Well, so yeah, thanks for joining me. I wanted to kind of like do a brief chat since we chatted last time about data contracts, data lineage areas that we can also collaborate. And I thought it would be good to have this on LinkedIn so that we can get any other questions, but really just to kind of have a record of talking a lot about the deeper ideas and implementation of how we see in industry or from our experiences. Um, so yeah, I appreciate you joining me. I don't think it's gonna be like an interview format. I think it's just gonna be us chatting. I don't know how you have your uh, screen set up, but I have it just on full screen so that I can just focus on the conversation here.
yeah, yep, sounds good to me.
Cool. So yeah, let's I guess maybe just first talk about data contracts and column lineage. I don't even know where we should start from. Maybe we can start from how you have ended up defining data contracts as kind of like your thing. I mean, it is a big part of maintaining data quality, but I'm sure this is an area that you have a lot of experience in from Convoy and also now working with multiple companies. So how would you define data contracts and what are the areas that you feel like is important to implement?
Yeah, so I would define data contract as a agreement between a producer and a consumer around what data should be generated from some data source. And a data producer is anyone that is either generating net new data or is adding some meaningful transformation to data that already exists. So it could be a software engineer, data engineer, potentially analytics engineer. It might even be someone who's non-technical. So if you've got like a Salesforce administrator or someone doing data entry, technically they could also be data producers as well. And then the data consumer is anyone that receives that data and then does something with it. So it could be a data engineer who's building a pipeline. It could be an analyst or a data scientist or even a product manager if you're looking at a dashboard. Um,
I
and
think this concept of
mm,
a data producer and consumer, like producer and consumer overall, can be
mm,
straightforward. But I think the definition of data sets and data products, like when you say they generate data or produce data sets, are we talking about database tables or like collection of initial data that could come from maybe CSV or some API endpoint, or are we just talking about maybe like remodel of the data sets? So like I joined a bunch of columns and created my own table. Like that's also a data set could be, right? Or data products. How would you define those? And are there any different levels of data set that you see it as,
yeah,
or data
yeah.
products that you see? Yeah.
Maybe a better way of defining it. So I think all of those are data sets. I
Mm-hmm.
sort of classify a data set, or really a data asset, I guess, is a better term. So this could be anything that um, represents data that will be produced. So like a protobuf file or an Avro file or JSON schema or something like that. Or a table or something that ultimately will generate a table at some point. So yeah, I think like a Snowflake table or a DBT model or a dashboard, like all of these to me are data assets where there is some data either about to be that will be produced or sort of represents data that is produced and has been structured and organized somewhere. It's a pretty big umbrella. And then so that was one part of your question, is like, what is a data set? I think data asset might be a little better of a descriptor. And then in terms of a data product, um, my thought around that is that I try to borrow from software engineering wherever I can. And I think that, just to not create the wheel and not recreate the wheel, and to have good collaboration with our data producer partners, that helps when you're using similar language. I think that a software product is basically just a collection of um, um, code-based components that are ultimately creating something that has business value. And I think the same is true in data. There's some collection of components that has business value, of data components, and that seems like very broad. And it's like, well, then what wouldn't be a data product? It's more like what isn't, then what is. And I think that where data is maybe going off the beaten path a little bit, but I think that where data has typically struggled is it hasn't done a good job identifying between like experimental sandbox environments and production environments. So I think the question is actually less about what is a data product and more like what is production. In software, this is pretty clear, right? You've got the what differentiates something, a product in production versus something that's kind of an MVP in a QA environment, is actually the process that's followed to get it there, right? Like you have to write documentation, ensure that there's SLAs for your API, you have unit tests, you have integration tests, you actually push it out through some CI/CD mechanism, you get your code reviewed in GitHub, you merge your branch, you maybe have a feature flag, then maybe you do an A/B test. So there's like this process of what it means to productionize software. And in data, that doesn't really exist. So like everything just kind of gets clumped together in the data warehouse. And there's some stuff in there that really is just in like a constant always on QA mode. And then there's some stuff in there that really is incredibly high quality and adds a ton of business value, but no one has gone through the process of productionizing those things. And so you have these really nasty like data quality and data governance issues that apply equally to everything.
So how would you, so is there a difference between data asset and data product, or is it just like a completely different concept? Because you see data product as production, like some data asset that is in production, maybe?
I think that,
or is there a different component of the data asset that needs to happen in order for it to become a data product?
I think that a data asset can be an input to a data product, or it could also be a data product on its own. So just to draw the parallel back to software, in software engineering, a product has like some interface. It can be a user interface, like some screens and buttons that a customer interacts with, or it can be an API. So it's just code. And then you've got a backend, right? And you've got your service, and you've got your like database, and you've got kind of all these things. And those are the components that people talk about when they say a product. You've got your interface, and you've got your backend. And I think in the data product world, you've got something similar where you've got your interface. Like that's the thing that is whatever the thing is that's delivering the value. That's what people are interfacing with. It could be a data API. It could be, the front end of a dashboard. It could be the output of a machine learning model. And then you've got you've got your pipeline, and you've got your data sources. And to me, that is the back end. Now, a component of that backend might spin out and ultimately become its own very useful data product. That like maybe you say, I want to train a model on this, intermediary table because it turns out it has a lot of value to me. And then it would become its own data product, and the data that feeds into it would be the backend. So to me, the data products are the output, and the pipeline and the data sources are the backend.
So if it's an output, what form do you think it takes in a data product?
What
Could be other, I guess, the other data assets, right? Because like earlier, like the producers will make data assets. I guess they could that data asset could itself be a also a data product, because other people can utilize it.
Yep.
And you're saying that some data products, some data assets will be the part of the backend going into different processes and pipelines or models to output other data assets. So would you consider any of those quote unquote backend processes as part of the data product?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I would
just the output.
I would consider the whole thing to be the product.
Yeah.
Right. Like in the same way, you know, when you have some software product team, it's everybody, right? It's your front end engineers, your back end engineers, it's everybody kind of working together to produce this output. The output is just the interface, right? It's just the thing that people are interacting with to get value from, but the whole pipeline is actually the product.
Yeah, no, I think this is a great clarification of this definition of data products, because I think there is a lot of different, saying or definition around this. And I myself have talked about this specific topic before with other data folks. I did a fireside chat, kind of like this, but on a stage at Data Connect this year with Solmaz, who used to be the head of data, SVP of data at Shopify. Her definition of data products was something that was actually so it has an interface that you can actually utilize. Just like any product, it has features and attributes that, so an example of data product for her were like fraud detection model.
Yep.
Or recommendation engine that itself is a product, and it's a data product because it's backed by data. It has the basis around data. And I thought that was like a really good distinction between that and like just data sets. At the same time, in a lot of enterprises, a lot of them actually do define data products as set of data assets.
Yeah.
And that might be because, like what you mentioned, it can be a set of data sets, can be a data product, because the end users, such as like business stakeholders, they will use that set of data assets directly into, I don't know, Excel, Google Sheets, and then kind of do their analysis. Because those data sets are curated, verified, and designed in a way that it is geared towards providing certain output or certain, helping the decision making. So I think that's I think the part that you're kind of like connecting the dots for me, which is super helpful, because I've also talked about this topic with other people before, but I think that's a good analogy. Like also with like the front end and back end, or the interface and the back end.
Yeah,
yeah.
Oh,
I think this like concept of producer is the part that's really also confusing. Like, do I have to be an engineer, or is that if I make a dashboard, like, am I a data producer? Right.
You could be. I think you could be. So in fact, I was just talking to someone the other day who they had this big data quality issue because somebody made a dashboard, and then another team took a dependency on that dashboard data, and then it's like, well, if you made you're sort of an unintentional producer. I think that people, and this is kind of one of the problems with data, or one of the challenges I would say, is that it's very, very easy to become an unintentional producer, or you become a producer and you don't even know about it, right? So I call it I think a producer is anybody that created and owns and maintains some data set, or some data asset that is being leveraged by others. There is a difference. So I mentioned before that I like to draw comparisons between software engineering, but it's also useful to distinguish where data and software engineering are different and have to be treated differently. And the biggest area, in my opinion, is this idea of producers and consumers, because in the data world is much more like a supply chain, where you've got like one source system on, sort of all the way to the left, that's kind of like, this is our source of truth data, and then that might get transformed 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different times, and then that ultimately feeds into a dashboard, and maybe that dashboard feeds into something else, and you have these like long, tightly coupled chains of dependencies by design, and you can't really get away from that, because we're not. It's not like software that's kind of this very abstract. Like, I can go out and just build some new software system 0 to 1 that has never existed before today. I can't like actually create a new concept in data that doesn't really exist in the real world, right? Like, there has to be, like, there in the real world, there is a concept called margin, and there is a concept called revenue, and there is like a thing called a customer, and I can like maybe create my own little derivations of that, but like all of these things refer to stuff that's actually happening in the world. So there's kind of a like, these dependencies actually have to, they have to exist in the same way there are actual relationships between objects in the world, and so it's impossible, in my opinion, to live in this totally decentralized, decoupled universe that software engineers live in, where they can just create stuff and it doesn't necessarily need to interface with each other. And in the world that we're talking about with data, the concept of the producer and the consumer become so much more important, because you realize that you're actually sort of one link in the chain, and you have to be very careful about, like, if I am part of this supply chain, who is actually using this data? Are they using it the right way? Am I using data the right way? Because I am sort of representing some concept in the world, and I've become the arbiter of that concept. And software engineers don't have to think about that, right? They don't really have to think about the fact that, I am the arbiter of truth. I've defined what a customer is, and now the entire organization is going to depend on me for that knowledge. And that's a big difference.
Sure. Actually, just from what you said, there are a few things that kind of popped up in my head. One is that, at the core, like at the atomic level, software is just a piece of code. And data is just a piece of file. And in order, you just mentioned how, like, software all like working on, people building their own applications independently. But if you think about like large software, most of them are modularized, right? This is how distributed teams can work on different features of the software or functions. Mm-hmm. But the way that each module or each component can talk to each other is actually through data. They have to pass some type of state with each other in order for them to work together.
Yep.
And for data alone does not provide much value unless you're putting some analysis or code or, to augment it. So I think it's almost like they always go hand in hand together to provide any value.
Yeah,
Do you agree?
Kind of. I think it depends, right? So there's an interesting metaphor that's sort of like, if you sort of like open your eyes and you look around the room and you collect a lot of information, is it important to collect that information even if it has no value, right? Like, if I was like walking down the street, and I only collected the information that had value to me in that moment, should my brain just like throw it out the window or be like, this is useless because I can't actually use it right now? I think most people would say no. I would say
What I'm saying is that you do not see the value unless there's context of where that data fits in.
Yes, that I agree with. I think that the context, the data must have context in order for it to be valuable. But I think that data is also different, and this is I think that software has value. Like the way that we talk about value for data and value for software is like a slightly different thing. Like I think software is designed for it has some operational function. Like I'm building this
Yes.
code for a reason, and that reason
Agree.
is to serve a customer. But the kind of the base level of data is truth, right? Like I'm actually collecting this data because I want to understand the world. And once I understand the
Sure.
world, I can take some action based off of it, and whether it's an analytical action or an operational action. But there's this foundational level of like things actually need to be correct, and that results in very different. Like it's subtle, but there's a very different management principle for those two kind of atomic units.
Totally. Yeah, I agree. And in a way, the context here is important in order for one to understand your truth.
Right.
Because your truth, your data may not be as valuable for me because I don't know the context, or it's not true for me, but it's so true for you because you created or like manipulated that data. I also think the other part about data, like analogy between data and software, and initially you talked about these accidental data producers, right? And that happens a lot often than I guess accidental programmers. Is that data has this like it really democratizes has a lot wider footprint of the way that this can be used because it's an asset, right? Can take many different forms, does not require a lot of training or education prior to use data. Obviously, there's a big range that that as you learn more about how to use data, like whether SQL or programming languages or BI tools, things like that, there's a lot more things you can do. But data itself, I think, has just a lot broader implication and or more of a broader applications and usage. And I think that's why also there can be many accidental data producers.
Yeah, I definitely think that's part of it. Is way broader. I think the languages to access data are much more accessible, and that increases the ability for less technical people to ask questions, but it also can increase the likelihood for things to go wrong. But also, I think the other thing that the other reason that you don't see too many accidental software engineers is that in order to access information about a service, you have to be very explicit about offering it, right? Like I actually have to make an API that can be accessible to some other service that wants to talk to my service. But in data, like technically everything that we create in a analytical database that is open is its own API because it has a schema, it has like I can go in and access the data that you create. So it's like everybody is kind of creating their own APIs.
Yeah.
Whether they intend for
or
them
their
to
own truth. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. Like kind of like the reason why in quote unquote data democratized environment or more self-service analytics environment, you just get to see a lot of data sprawls. It just continues. Like people just start creating their own truth or own like a analysis, something new they discovered as they play with or use data, which I think is from that exploration, you also find like a really important, insight that you didn't know about. At the same time, management of that is also tricky. And I guess that's where, I guess this is where the context is important, but also the data contracts come in. So let's dive into a little bit more about data contracts because data can be, or data assets can be so many different things. The producers are not just engineers or analysts. How do you see the implementation of data contract happening, or like today, like where we are today, and what are the areas that you feel like it's kind of like almost like there are probably something areas of, or do you believe that data contracts can be implemented for every single data assets and producers? Because I feel like that's gonna almost impossible to do. But in certain perspectives, like when it's a data pipeline, production pipeline, or things like that, there should definitely be a data contracts, or having data contracts make it much. You can have the actual correct quality data when you have data contracts. So maybe can you elaborate that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, to kind of tie together a lot of the things that we've been talking about, and to answer maybe your last question first, I think that the purpose of a data contract is to be the really the final step in the chain that differentiates a data asset that exists in some sandbox playground environment with a data product that is living in some production environment. And the way to think about it is like creating that API. So it's sort of like saying, hey, I've got all this data that I'm using everywhere, and I've generated maybe a training set for a machine learning model, and I'm testing it out, and maybe it's going to be useful, but maybe it's not going to be useful. I probably don't want to create that API myself, because I don't want other people to necessarily take a dependency on me before it's ready. In fact, funny story, I have a friend when I was working at Microsoft on Bing ads, and this person was a data scientist, and so they were doing a lot of iteration. They owned one of the fraud detection models, and they created a training set for a model and used it for about like 3 to 4 months, and then decided, not really worth my time. We're going to go in another direction. And then about a year later, they were sitting in a presentation with another team, also within the Bing organization, that was presenting some findings from a model that they were deploying. And it turned out that they had taken dependency on the training set that this guy had created 6 or 8 months ago, and then threw it away and hadn't really maintained it because it wasn't that useful. And he was like, what the heck? I can't believe that somebody would do. So it goes back to that unintentional producer side of things. And there's a big cost to that. Like, I think ownership in general has a cost. It's really important to have governance and to have ownership, but you really should focus on governance and ownership where it matters to the business, and when you have a lot of trust in the data. And that's the other sort of differentiator that the contract adds. One of the questions that I get sometimes is like, what goes into the contract? Is it just the schema of a data set? And I think that it can be the entire schema of some data set that is part of a data product. So that could be, the back end or the front end. But it could also be a subset of that. So we saw this a lot at Convoy, where you would have some software engineer who owned a database, and they had a bunch of tables that were very useful to the company. But then they also they would have some columns within those tables that were internal details, right? These are things that only the people on that team really should be accessing, either because they were experimental, or because they were undocumented, or because it was something machine generated that nobody was going to understand. And they would exclude those from the contract. They're like, I'm going to expose these 6 or 7 columns because I know they're super useful to the business, and there is an expectation and a certain SLA that needs to exist. And all these other things I'm going to keep hidden. Now, if someone wants to go into the sandbox environment and take a dependency on those things there, that's totally fine, because anything that exists in the sandbox is not supposed to be production anyway. And in fact, we had some barriers in place that would prevent sandbox-based data assets from being a data product. So we always required people to move over into one, like, be very explicit about which environment you're in, and then use the contract as that delineating mechanism.
Got it. So it almost feels like, to me, data contract kind of advances, like it's kind of almost like a next step after you have your like quote unquote data mart with like medallion architecture. You have these raw tables and available analytical tables that anyone can go and use. But then, like, if I say I have these data sets that I always use, or model that I have built based on this data, so along with the model and the data sets that are related to, let's say, fraud detection, I am going to publish this data product, and when I am publishing it, meaning I am okay with other people using this. I would like other people to utilize what I've done, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel. But I'm also so I will put documentation or whatnot, like as part of the contract, right?
Yeah, and I think I think there's a few things that the contract actually entails. So there's the there's a documentation component. So I think the contract is two pieces. There's the spec, kind of like an API spec that says, this is like how this is how you should be using this API, which is different from the documentation around it, which is more around like, what is this API? Like, what am I actually getting back? And then the enforcement of it, which is once we have this contract in place, it is an agreement between two sides. So there is an expectation on the producer to always ensure that what they promise is actually what they end up delivering. And there's also an expectation on the consumer that they should only be using that the data in the way that the API owners maintain. And I think that there's also two ways to go about implementing it. One is what you said, which is, if I am the consumer, I've created something, now I want to make it accessible to the rest of my organization. The other, and that's, I think, more of the sort of standard software engineering approach, right? I've created a service. I want to make this service available via an API to my customers. I think the other way is a bit of the inverse, and this is more unique to the data world, which is like, because I can go in and take any dependencies I want on any data set that's been created in the company, and because data is highly experimental, I might take a dependency on something that doesn't have a contract yet. And that's totally fine, right? Like, because there is a cost to these things. Anything where there is governance, there is like a cost. So if I'm a software engineer, I probably don't want to put a data contract on my data if I don't even know it's going to be useful to anybody yet. So let's say I'm a data scientist, I've built out my model, and I have like 2 or 3 upstream dependencies that are really important. At that point in time, I might want to go to my producers and say, hey guys, I've taken a dependency on you. I've actually found something that's really meaningful and I would like to productionize it, but I need you to take a contract with me because there's an expectation around like quality and SLA that I would like to have. And the fact that I've got this really powerful use case is the motivating factor for that. Like, I'm not just asking you to take a data contract for no reason and you don't get anything from it. You are actually now powering something that is really meaningful to the company.
Yeah, I'm actually using this.
Right.
And
I'm
there
actually
maybe more people using this.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's a powerful concept.
Yeah. And I think that there is, I'm sure you've seen it many times, but like when I was first coming up through software engineering, and someone explained the principles of an API to me, the analogy they used was to the restaurant and the waiter, and how the restaurant goer would make the request, and then the waiter would take the request back to the chef, and the chef would return what the restaurant goer had asked for. And what I'm sort of realizing, or what I realized for the data side of things, I'm sure it applies to software as well, but I think there's some interesting reasons why it hasn't actually been applied there, is that there's another step that has been left out of that metaphor, which is the feedback loop of the customer back to the chef, right? Like, you actually should be able to tell the chef if you gave me the right thing, right? Like, is this what I wanted? Was it actually high quality? Was it good? Should I go and leave a review somewhere? And I think that feedback loop is really important on the data side as well, of the contract not just being this static object that a producer says, here you go, I'm giving you the thing and you're going to enjoy it, right? Take it. I, as a consumer, should be able to say, this data that you're giving me has a lot of null values. This isn't working for my use case. That's not a part of the contract today, but I would like it to be. and it would add a lot of value if you added that in, right? And producers should take
Sure.
that into account, review it, and modify their contracts accordingly. And when you can imagine these feedback loops happening all across the business, you now have an enormous amount of collaboration and communication about the way we use the data, in a manner that I don't think exists in most companies today.
Right, right. No, I think that's a very good point. Um, in terms of maintaining the data quality for the important data or for the data that is actually being utilized. So, how do you currently recommend or implement data contracts today?
So there's a few ways of doing it. I wrote an article called "The Engineer's Guide to Data Contracts" where I laid this out. But the way basically that we did it at Convoy is we started by defining our we called them tier 1 data services. So these were all of the data products, the data assets at our company that were extraordinarily valuable, and they already had some owner that had a expectation of quality and governance from the upstream systems producing that data. And this is where the conversation about Lineage comes into play, I think. Those teams then needed to figure out what all of their upstream sources actually were. And then they could request contracts for those teams, right? They could say, look, I've got this really important data service that the entire business acknowledges is critical. Here are what my expectations are based on my data set. Like, we consume a customer ID. We always expect that to be a 6-character string. And so I need you to create a contract. And even if you're only putting the contract around that single column, it would still have incredible utility for me. At the simplest level, contracts can be done with a pen and a piece of paper, right? As long as the owning team is maintaining the data according to the expectations of the consumer, technically you've got a contract in place there. But obviously it would be better. It'd be better for this to be done using programmatic mechanisms. So the way that we think about it is that the contract itself ideally should be technology agnostic, but the enforcement of that contract needs to be technology specific. So at Convoy, again, we used a YAML file, and PayPal also used a YAML file. And that file basically contained a few variables, like what is the expected schema, what's the name of the contract, who is the actual contract owner. That would be added to the Git repository of the owning team. And then there were various mechanisms of enforcement that we implemented. I like focusing on checks in CI/CD that are essentially looking at the output of changes to data, like the output of a data migration, or looking at the information schema when doing, and then comparing that to what's in the contract and saying this either meets the expectation that we have defined or not. And if it doesn't, then the contract acts as an integration test and it just fails to build. There's
right,
other
or it needs to pass these set of tests, like these validation tests, in order
exactly,
for
yeah,
as the right PR or change.
That's exactly right. And if you want to, and it's the type of thing where, like, sometimes contracts do need to change in the same way that sometimes APIs need to change because we're refactoring our services, and that's fine. But that requires an update to the contract. And this is the point where teams can begin to put process around what does that workflow look like, right? If I, as the owner of a contract, am going in to update it in a way that would potentially break my consumers, maybe I have a 7-day SLA there. Or maybe I have to make sure that all the consumers of this contract who have data products need to give a sign off before I'm allowed to actually push this change. So that's kind of what creates that facilitates the change management at the code level.
Yeah.
In the same way an API does. Yeah.
Yep, for sure. And a good point earlier, I think we got so deep into data contracts and data products, so we forgot to talk about column level lineage. Now let's talk about column level lineage for a second. What is your reason why column level lineage is much more important for data contracts than lineage or table level lineage or asset level lineage today?
Yeah, so I think the big there's kind of like been a promise of lineage that's like, hey, we as a data platform team or as like a data organization, we're really excited about Lineage, and the way people are going to use it is anytime they want to make changes, or they want to, write a new query, they're going to go in and investigate and kind of see how all the pieces are connected. And I find that doesn't always happen, or it doesn't always happen into the frequency and the degree that teams really want. And I think that the reason that is,
You mean like looking at Lineage prior to making changes?
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I think that I think Lineage is one of the most powerful tools in data. Column level Lineage, in particular, is one of the most powerful tools in data that we have. But I think that it needs to be. I think that needs to be like coupled with a use case to be really, really effective. And the use case for contracts in particular is that if I am if I'm working on a data product, right? Like if I'm a data scientist or an analyst and I'm kind of building my data product in my sandbox environment, and then I become ready to deploy it, well, then the question is, okay, I'm ready to move from sandbox to production. I want data contracts on all of my upstream sources. What are my upstream sources, right? Like, where do I actually put these contracts? It's really, really hard to manually go in and try to like work back through all of the code and figure out, well, what contracts exist or not. If you don't know the answer to that question, you actually don't know the level of risk that your data product potentially is under, right? There might be 20 different sources that feed into my data product. Maybe only 2 or 3 of them are under contract. And that means for 17 of them, the data can change out from under my feet at any time. And that's actually really scary if I have something that I always expect to have a certain level of quality and an SLA. And so the lineage is necessary in order for me to figure out what the blast radius could potentially be, where the contracts need to exist, and then allow me to not only do that, but also to figure out what contract needs to exist as well. If the lineage exists at the table level, I don't really know exactly what the contract should be. I have a view of like where all the data like is kind of going, but I really need that specificity, right? I need to be able to tell the producer, hey, like you guys own one column called, vehicle ID, and I depend on that 3 layers deep, and I need you to put a contract on this vehicle ID. Otherwise, like if you make a change, it's going to be a ripple effect all the way downstream, and it's going to break me. So I think that's where column lineage fits in, and it's really, really important. And I think I've been calling this reverse lineage, which is actually a lot easier to do than lineage in the opposite direction, where you're kind of starting from the top and you're trying to figure out like what are all the dependencies everywhere. It's so much easier to do lineage when you're starting at the bottom and you're saying, I want to know what are all the dependencies of this like this data product that I really care about.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, in a way, the way that we generate automated column lineage is starting from a place at the downstream level. Actually, that's how it works, right? Because you need to look at how the data asset or data product has been generated, whether that is through a SQL query or another API or whatever, parse through that to understand what my sources are, who my parents are. And from there, we go up level. So per attribute, where is this actually related to? I think that part, without column level, this is like not enough details for you to find out. You are going to end up with like 20, 30 different things to look into, and you wouldn't see the clear difference or clear delineation of where it came from. So I think that's why column level lineage is so important. And then the reason why it also is so important for data contract is around this enforcement, right? For you to, first discovery, visibility around what data contracts do I really need, given that my sources and I am dependent on these sources. And if I am, then you would want to make sure every time there's a change on that upstream, you are getting notified, or you are getting a heads up, in a way where you are aware of these changes. So right. I think, these are two, both kind of upstream and downstream, really important side of data lineage, where, we're also seeing a lot of like a lot of the things that we started now implemented, it was around this communication of change management, right?
Yes.
Some people may have nothing to do with both data producers and consumers. I mean, they are all quote unquote consumers, like viewer of a dashboard. They have no idea and they don't care where the data came from. They want to make sure the data is correct and is up to date, right? But they may also need to be informed that the dashboard, right now or for the next couple of days may not be stable or may display wrong values because the source data is being migrated.
That's right.
And I think that is all an important part of both data lineage and contract because it affects, more than just data producers and consumers.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, and I think the change management part is really critical. The way that I like to think about contracts is that it bridges the divide between the teams that are writing code that generates data and the teams that are using that data to do something. And Lineage, in a lot of ways, is the bridge, right? You like that is actually the bridge. Like the you can certainly have contracts without Lineage, but it requires already knowing in advance what are the data sets that you want to apply these things to. It's like, all right, I know I've got some services. I know these services are really important to me. I know, like, roughly speaking, what data is coming out of these things. I know that there are some files that are meaningful. But the majority of the data consumers at a company don't know that, right? They're working on data that has been given to them. If you follow the medallion architecture, like you were mentioning before, maybe it's through some existing like gold layer. They're not really thinking about what's going on at the source or what's going on at the raw layer. Like that's sort of not where their focus is, and they can't really be expected to do that much research into
Right.
where all their data is coming from. So, but they still need the protection all the same, right? They still want their data to not change out from underneath them or display wrong values, and they have to be able to communicate that expectation to a producer somewhere. But they're not going to be able to do it manually in a very effective way, and the column level lineage becomes extraordinarily important in that regard.
For sure. I just realized that we have 8 minutes left, and I have 2 questions here already. So those who are listening, if you have more questions, please post it on comments, and we can try to start answering these questions. What do you think, Chad?
Let's do it.
All right. The first question is from Akil. Do you think too many unorganized dashboards or pipelines or producers sometimes lose the purpose of impactful analytics? How to solve that? I've seen people running ETL jobs in test environments and produce dashboards for years. Wait, so if people running ETL jobs in test environments and produce dashboards in test environment, then what is that for? I don't know. Have you seen a lot of cases like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the core of this question is like what we were talking about earlier in the conversation, which is like what happens when you really don't have a thing called production. And I'll add a little bit of context into what I've seen in other organizations and other stuff we've done. Is like we actually had very strict rules about who could use the output of an MVP data product if it was in this sandbox environment. So let's say that I create a dashboard, like a tablet dashboard or something like that. I don't have the ability to share that outside of my direct team. So if I want an executive to look at it, if I want another product manager to look at it, they just simply don't have access to it. And our reasoning was, if you want someone else to make a decision off of data that you have created, you need to go through at least like the foundations of ensuring that data is trustworthy. And that requires contracts and documentation and like lots of these other things. So there was actually a limit on what could be viewed elsewhere. And I think that something like that curtails the problem that Akil is talking about. If everybody has access to everything that has been created, then yeah, I think the water gets incredibly muddy. The other thing I'll say really quickly that I've seen, which has been super problematic, is that there's a reason that you have this like kind of exponential growth of both tables and pipelines and dashboards and everything else, and it's because the data is not trustworthy. So if I'm an analyst, I don't want to go and recreate the wheel every single time someone asks me a question, how many active customers do we have? But if I type in like active customers into my list of Tableau dashboards, or in, you know, the list of Snowflake tables or whatever, and there's like 30, you know, there's like 30 files that appear,
Yeah.
30 dashboards that appear, I'm going to go and figure out like, okay, who owns this? Then I'm going to try to look at the code, and then I'm going to try to understand, like, do I actually understand this SQL? Does it make sense to me? And if the answer is no, it doesn't, then I'm going to go back up to the source, and I'm going to talk to the engineers, and I'm going to say, hey, like, what does this data mean that you're emitting from your services? And then I'm just going to build it again. And the problem, not to get back to the change management stuff, but I think the root cause of that happening is the change management. Because the reason those queries get so long in the first place is because a thing changes in a service. Like, hey, we used to just have this concept called visitor, but now we also have this concept called impression. And it turns out that visitor is like a superset of impression data now. Well, as the owner of that dashboard, I have to like add a whole bunch of case when statements and like where clauses and other things into my query in order to revert the world back to the way that it was before this change was implemented. And that makes the query longer. And so you see that happen, you know, year after year after year after year. All these like little changes that get made add up to form this beastly monstrosity that nobody besides the person who made it actually understands. So I think that's a big root cause. And so sort of solution, sandbox environment, don't actually let people show untrustworthy things to the rest of the company. And then number two, make sure you're trying to solve the problem at the source, have good change management. And if you have ownership and contracts in place, then people are not going to need to like recreate the wheel every time.
Got it. I actually have a different point of view on this, because we work with a lot of customers that has that thousands and tens of thousands. I think I saw, I guess, up to 50,000 dashboards in an organization so far. And I think, yes, it is one of the reasons of why people were either they weren't aware of existing analytics and done, or they didn't have trust of, you know, somebody's test, you know, analytics about, you know, about customers. But I think the way that this happens, I think it's like a kind of like a good and bad thing. Sure, it's bad. It's like there's like it's out of control. People are creating their own definitions, whatever. But it's actually a good thing, because the data is actually democratized and it's actually being utilized, and it has invoked a lot of people to try to make their decisions based on data. And I think that's a good thing. The way to solve this, I think there are two ways, like top down or bottoms up. Like top down is what you just talked about, having the right contracts and access policies, so that if this is a new type of data, you won't be able to publish it, quote unquote, or allow other people to use it until it passes a certain, you know, threshold or standard. Another way that we have seen, and that's something that we help with a lot, is this bottoms up approach, where you get to see what the actual usage of that data set itself. Because when you look at both Lineage and Popularity, through Lineage, you can find out whether this end data product or data asset is utilizing the data the correct way, or if it's actually referring to the right source data. And with Popularity, you'll be able to find out like who else is actually utilizing this data, and when you're looking at multiple data sets, which one is the core data. We also see a lot of customers having their own notion of quote unquote verified dashboards, or their quote unquote gold or core tables, so that everyone's aware that those are the ones that, you know, people should depend on. And I think once that happens, that's like the, you know, but to make that happen, I think in the beginning, when you have so many unorganized dashboards and tables, I think something that we recommend a lot of our customers to do is deprecate them. The part that they don't know why, or the reason why usually that they cannot deprecate these is mainly because they don't know who's using it, and they don't know what it may impact downstream. So having that popularity and lineage combination, I think really helps on deprecating and downsizing all the unnecessary, unuseful, unorganized, or ad hoc analysis that's not super relevant anymore, because now we have an official dashboard type. I think it is a way to solve that. And that's something that I think data discovery really enables. Let's go to the next question. As producer of data, how should I make sure my consumers are aware of impactful changes?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing here is that there should be some mechanism of subscribing to data assets or contracts that a producer provides. One of the big issues, and this happens all the time with data migrations, is that you'll have someone who's a producer, they'll be deprecating a field, or maybe they'll be doing a refactor on a service, and they'll go into Slack and they'll put out this message and say, hey, you know, I'm gonna be deprecating some stuff. Does anybody care? Or I'm going to be making some changes. Does anyone care? And of course, the answer is no, because if or they don't get an answer back. And if you're a software engineer, right, and you're making your change in like Java or C# or something like that, that's not going to mean anything to an analyst that only knows SQL. Like, they're not going to know how to even interpret that. So if there is some way to subscribe to a contract at Convoy, we just did this through like GitHub repos where contracts were stored. And then when contracts get updated, everybody who was subscribing to those repos would get the notification. That's like a really easy way to keep people in the loop, right? And I think integrating with something like a catalog is really useful for this, because then you could say, hey, like we can clearly delineate what is a trustworthy data set and sort of what isn't. And as a producer, if you own your contract, then that's like a really good sign that the data is trustworthy. Your consumers can subscribe to changes to those data sets. And then when you make them, you can even include really, meaningful like contextual information and metadata about the change, right? Like, hey, I am changing this because we are doing a refactor, and here's what the data is going to look like now, and blah, blah, blah. And all of that just goes down. It goes out to everybody that consumes it. And they can review that code change with context. I think that's the most meaningful. That's the most meaningful thing. It's like you want your consumers to be reviewing data and not reviewing like pure JavaScript or like C# code. They know how to work with data. They don't know how to work with code as much.
Yeah, for sure. I think the CI is a really important part, right? One of our customers that claims like $1 million of ROI from SelectStar is because they just simply integrated our column level lineage API into their CI. The data engineering team is like, oh, I can finally sleep through the night. And I don't have to worry about moving fast because the CI is going to catch all the PRs that's going to, invalidate any of the downstream impact. They literally implemented this in the production side, so that if there's any changes in their like a production service like Postgres tables, those PRs get comments directly with the downstream impact that they're going to make, and that needs to be sufficed before they push the changes, which I think is really important for before making the changes. But sometimes you do have to make changes, and I think it is something that you do need to notify and make sure that all the consumers are aware of the impact too. So one of the things that we have recently released was this notify feature. And I think this is something that can be implemented in different ways. But the way that we did it was that for any of the table owners or data managers, if they want to use this feature as notify, they can basically send notification or email to everyone that is quote unquote related to that table. The way we define this is first, all the owners of downstream tables to this. The second is top users of this table. So anyone that ran like select query in the last 30 days, you're going to get this notification. And there's a third group, which is downstream dashboard consumers. So these are consumers that are dependent on the data directly because they consume this dashboard a lot. So those are 3 groups that we allow our users to add notification or send notification. So they can do either like 2 things, or they can choose 1 or 2 groups. One is you can do it in advance as more of like, hey, we have this change coming up. So like if you're downstream table, owners, you should migrate or you should change your, source columns to this. So they get notified, and then you can give a deadline. You need to do it by like, X date. Right now, I see a lot of customers doing this in their engineering process manually in Slack, and they'll like tag people. So that's like something that we try to automate. The second part is that you can also say, hey, this migration, we have deprecated this table, or we are about to deprecate this table. So this has actually happened. Like this is actually, I think, more applicable for dashboard perspective. So you can say, hey, like business users consuming any of the data coming from this dashboard, we have deprecated this. So please use this new dashboard that uses the correct data. And I think those are the 2 ways that you can really work with your downstream data consumers that are actually querying the tables, as well as your real downstream consumers, like business stakeholders that get impacted by any of the data changes that happen upstream.
Well, this has been great, Shinji. I do have to run.
I realize that we're over 5 minutes, but thank you so much for joining me today, Chad. This was a lot of fun, and thank you everyone who's joining this on the live show. If this was helpful, just post on the comments so we can keep doing this. And yeah, I love your Christmas tree, by the way, Chad. And happy holidays. Thanks for joining me today, really.
Of course.
And you have a great weekend.
You too. Bye-bye.
I'll see you later. Bye.